Okay, everyone, welcome back. So, if you'll recall from last lesson, we were discussing the philosopher David Hume and how he gave us something called Hume's fork, which was supposed to encompass all statements that humans could make. And we got to the point where we realized he did not account for moral facts. So, we analyzed what that meant, and we realized that he had created something called the is-ought problem. Maybe he hadn't created it, but he had identified it. And what that means is we cannot actually determine how we should behave or how to guide human behavior based on facts about the natural world or just scientific facts. So we were left at a pretty tough place. So today we are going to move on to something called meta-ethics. So we have already discussed a lot this year about what ethics means, right? Trying to determine what is right from wrong or what is good versus evil. But meta-ethics is concerned with what do we actually mean by those words, that moral language that we use. When we believe something is right and we believe something is wrong, or we label things as good or evil, what do we actually mean by that? It's a deeper understanding of how we classify things. So it's comparable to the analogy of politics, right? If you have certain personality traits or certain beliefs about societal institutions, sometimes you can be categorized as a liberal or as a conservative or as a Green Party follower. And understanding why you fit into those categories is very important because then you can better explain why you think the way that you do. So that's what we're going to do for ethics. We're going to explore why we use certain moral language and what we mean by the moral language that we're using. All right, now we have to look at the key theories or the key categories of this meta-ethics topic. So we're going to see two sides here, or two categories. One of them is called cognitivism and one of them is called non-cognitivism. And then each of those categories will have two subcategories, so we'll have four in total. Let's start with cognitivism. So if you are using moral language in a certain way that demonstrates that you believe morality can be decided by thinking about it, by using your cognition, so you're using your reasoning skills, your logic, your thinking abilities. If you think that you can determine morality in that way, you are following the way of cognitivism. So this branch also accepts that morality exists. It's not just something that is metaphysical or people that make up or opinion-based. It's actually something that exists in an objective world. So it would be based on undeniable natural facts. So we're going to try to use facts here to determine our ethics. And that is supposed to be something that we're not able to do based on the is-ought problem. But cognitivism says that we can do this. Cognitivism says that moral statements become factual statements. So if we say a statement such as stealing is wrong, cognitivism would simply say that is true. Also, we could say helping people is bad. That would be a false statement. Now, you can already think about arguments about why that is incorrect or the theory has flaws, but cognitivism says that those moral statements can be accepted as facts. So what is morally right and wrong can be factually known, and cognitivism accepts that. The first subcategory of this branch called cognitivism is what we call naturalism. So it's got the word natural in there. Naturalism claims that moral statements can be simplified to natural statements. So every time we want to say something that is ethical, an ethical statement based on right and wrong or good and evil, we are stating a natural fact. So most commonly, people will equate good with pleasure and bad with pain. Sometimes people use the word well-being or human flourishing, right? We're basically calculating how much good a certain action does for people. So that means that we're using almost like a mathematical scenario here. So we're using that pain-pleasure principle we already discussed to determine whether an action is good. And these are utilitarian principles, right? Determining the consequences of an action to figure out whether it is the right thing to do. So in this scenario, here are some examples. Feeding the hungry would equal good or the right thing to do. Hitting someone would equal bad, a bad action or a wrong action. Why are those good and bad? Well, feeding the hungry leads to pleasure and decreases pain. Hitting someone causes pain. So we can use our senses to determine if our actions cause pleasure and pain. All we have to do is observe what happens after our actions are committed and use that to decide if they are right and wrong. So this is definitely an empirical method here. We're observing, we're seeing what actually happens through our observation, and then we're deciding whether that was a good or a bad action. So this is clearly where the utilitarian approach to ethics comes from. This naturalism as a subcategory of cognitivism is using utilitarian principles. It's kind of like a scientific approach to ethics, right? So we figure out how much pain or pleasure is the end result of the equation, and then we plug in certain actions, we do a calculation, and we observe, and then we see what the result was, and we determine whether it was ethically right or wrong based on the output of that equation. Along the timeline of philosophy, a fellow came along by the name of G.E. Moore, and he recognized a problem with naturalism. And this became a famous fallacy recognition, and to this day it's called Moore's naturalistic fallacy. So if you ever hear somebody arguing by using naturalistic arguments, you can probably claim they're making a naturalistic fallacy. Now, what exactly is the fallacy? It seems as if the argument of naturalism as a subcategory of cognitivism is actually committing circular logic. By saying that anything good is related to pleasure, there's already a hidden assumption there, or a circular reasoning. Right? It's saying that pleasure is automatically good already, and then it's calculating how much pleasure you get out of the scenario to determine whether it's good. So pleasure is already assumed to be good, and you might say that that's common sense, that pleasure is good, but it still is an assumption, because there can be arguments, which we'll see in a minute, of when pleasure is not necessarily good. So if pleasure is already assumed to be good, as it is being done in this theory, then asking, is pleasure good, becomes a meaningless question. It would be the same as asking, is good good? Right? You can see how that doesn't make sense. It's just a circular question. So this flaw in the logic of naturalistic ethics makes it, at the very least, unhelpful, or possibly even an incomplete theory. Something is missing. Now let's think of those examples that prove this wrong. So the assumption about pleasure being good is not always true, since we can think of many examples to the contrary. Remember, we discussed people that take pleasurable drugs would describe those as causing a lot of pleasure, but many people would argue that that is not an ethically right thing to do. Or medical procedures that cause pain. Those would be seen as bad because they cause pain, but clearly you can see how that would be a positive in the end. So Moore believed that there are objective moral truths, but he felt that we need innate intuitions. Right? So this is bringing back rationalism again. He doesn't understand or accept that empiricism can explain this whole pain-pleasure principle and explain all ethics. It doesn't work. So he thinks that we need to go back to innate intuitions that we have, that conscience factor, right? We just recognize when things are right or wrong based on how we feel. Maybe it's based on our upbringing, maybe it's based on some genetic information, but we definitely cannot rely on naturalism, Moore says. This leads us to the next subcategory of cognitivism called intuitionism. Now the root word there is obvious, intuition. This is the rationalist perspective of cognitivism. Humans have an innate ability to recognize what is morally right and morally wrong. This assumes, as Plato did, that we are born with innate knowledge. Now, this would also say that good and bad cannot be defined on an individual basis, but can be recognized or identified. To put that another way, we can't put into words what certain ethical situations are, like describe why it's good or describe why it's bad. We can try, but oftentimes it falls short. What we can do more reliably is simply recognize it. Like, I know that is bad based on intuition, or I know that is good based on intuition. A good analogy for understanding this is thinking of colors, right? Think of the color green. try to put down a definition or write down words that would let somebody know what green is. Now, I think all you could really do here, your limitations would be to label or list a bunch of things that are green, but that would be based on the assumption that somebody already knows what green is and can go look at those objects and recognize that they are green. What we can do with colors is we can recognize them. Once we learn what they are, and if we have the ability to see colors, we're not colorblind in some way, then we can recognize those colors. So I can recognize trees as green, I can recognize the sky as blue, but I can't necessarily describe what that color is. So again, you cannot define colors using language, but you can recognize them. Think of ethics in the same way. You cannot necessarily define good or bad scenarios using language, but you can recognize them based on your innate knowledge. So objective moral facts still exist here. That's why it's still under cognitivism. There are objective moral facts that we can think about and understand, but they require our human intuition to discover them. There is one reality that happens a lot when discussing philosophy that poses a huge problem for both categories of cognitivism. So both naturalism and intuitionism have a problematic issue, and that is the fact that moral dilemmas exist. If there actually is, as cognitivism claims, an objective moral fact or a set of them, these are unchangeable, undeniable facts that are always true or always false no matter what. If that's the case, then why would we have moral dilemmas? It doesn't really make sense. Let me explain why. How can two people have opposite opinions about a moral issue, but both believe wholeheartedly that he or she is correct? So we're supposed to recognize that, say, a statement such as stealing is wrong. That is 100% all of the time a moral fact. But what if two people completely disagree on that issue? Now, they probably won't on that specific example, but they definitely will if you bring up any of those controversial issues that we discussed during moral ethics earlier in the year. So moral issues such as capital punishment, euthanasia, abortion, war. These are highly controversial topics that people strongly disagree on. And we recognize it as a fact of reality that people disagree on these things because they have different perspectives. But according to the theory of cognitivism, this shouldn't be the case. People shouldn't believe opposite opinions on something when there is a moral fact. If you're going to accept that cognitivism is true and moral dilemmas also exist, you have to argue one of two things. Either one of the people in that argument is completely confused or wrong about the natural fact in question, or that person just doesn't have any moral intuitions to understand that ethical problem. I don't think too many people would be able to argue either of these things, right? Although some people, when they really believe strongly about something, they believe the people on the other side are completely wrong, so they might argue that. But I think that's an unreasonable stance, and we should all consider that. And then I think that it would also be unreasonable to assume that some people just don't have moral intuition, and so they don't have the ability to recognize when things are right or wrong. They don't have a conscience, unless, of course, you're talking about someone who is a statistical outlier, like a psychopath or a sociopath. So doing either of these things seems to put the whole theory into question. When we consider the fact that someone might be completely wrong about a moral fact or have no moral intuitions whatsoever, it really throws cognitivism for a loop. It makes us question whether it's the right way to go about determining ethics. Or if it's not the right way, maybe, like many theories, it's incomplete and needs to be combined with something else. Instead of trying to adapt cognitivism or incorporate other theories into it, some people jump right to non-cognitivism. They basically decide that if you can't have moral facts based on the problems that result, they decide that morality is subjective. Morality is just dependent on who you ask. There are no objective truths according to non-cognitivism. So you can't say that a moral statement is based on undeniable natural fact. It's just not the case. People who ascribe to non-cognitivism would say that moral statements are not factual statements, they're opinions. If you say something about what you think is right or what you think is wrong, what you think is good or evil, you're simply giving your opinion. So let's go back to those same examples that we began with. When you say that stealing is wrong, you can't say whether that's true or false. It's an unknown. Or when you say that helping people is bad, that's an unknown. Maybe there's not enough information yet. It's not true or false, it's unknown. So non-cognitivism says that what is morally right and wrong cannot actually be known. It can't be a fact. You can't simply just learn the facts and understand them. They are dependent on certain other factors. It depends on how one feels about it. Now we're at another tough position to say that we're going to base things on how people feel. I think we've discussed things in the past when we began learning about philosophy together that relying on how people feel is so unreliable. I mean, individual people can feel differently than everyone else. And if we're going to say that we're going to base morality on how people feel, that's going to lead us to a situation where you have to trust every individual intuition or every individual perspective. And so we have quotes today that kind of follow these guidelines, such as live your truth, right? So it's almost like it's dismissing the fact that there's an objective truth and saying that truth is subjective. And a lot of people do not like those ideas, and we'll probably see why pretty soon. Let's look at the two branches of non-cognitivism. The first one is called emotivism. Emotivism claims that a statement can only be true if it is empirically verifiable. That means it can be proven by experiment. If you can't do that, it can't be claimed as a true statement. And since moral statements cannot be empirically verified, we get a certain conclusion based on emotivism. Emotivism says, therefore, moral statements are meaningless statements. This goes all the way back to Hume's fork, right? He says that anything that is not an a priori statement or a probable statement is a meaningless statement. So these are just expressions of feeling or emotion. You're just letting people know how you feel. You're responding to your emotions. So when you say something like stealing is wrong, there's no way to verify that that is a true or false statement. What you're really saying here when you say stealing is wrong is you're just leaving out a couple of words. What you mean to say is, I feel like stealing is wrong. Stealing is wrong to me. It's what my feelings tell me is true. So words like good, bad, right, wrong, these are just human expressions of the approval or disapproval of the person saying them. If I want to approve of something, I'll call it good or right. If I disapprove of something, I'll call it bad or wrong. So if I'm talking about stealing and trying to teach people, maybe a child, lessons of why they shouldn't steal, I would simply be saying things as objective statements, or they would sound like it. But what I really mean is, I don't like stealing. I don't like people who steal. I don't believe it's a good behavior to have, and I have a lot of intuitions or feelings about that. So that is what you are saying when you make moral statements. Emotivism has an alter ego. Many people refer to emotivism as the boo hooray theory, because this is what you're technically doing when you talk about morality. If you don't like something, you boo it, right? So you see somebody acting in a certain way that you disapprove of, and you think boo, or you actually literally call them out and shame them. This happens a lot online today. If you actually do like something, you cheer it. You support someone who is doing something. You say, hooray, I approve of that. So you might say, boo stealing, and hooray charity. So what you're really doing here is you're just expressing how you feel about certain behaviors. You're supporting the ones that you approve of, and you're shaming the ones that you disapprove of. It's not difficult to see the problems that could result from emotivism here. If we're going to decide what is right and wrong just based on people's immediate emotional reaction, well, emotions can often be irrational, or feelings can often be very unreliable or based in ignorance. So if this happens online, which I believe is a new phenomenon, right? Online shaming. We have a situation where somebody says something and it could be taken completely out of context, or maybe it was a mistake that they said that and they want to take it back. But it turns into a scenario of mob mentality, where people are jumping on this person, attacking them online, getting a bunch of people to shame them, wanting them to be fired from their jobs, or just tackling their credibility and taking them down in some way. It seems like this has led to some sort of a phenomenon where people are patrolling the internet, looking for opinions they disagree with, and finding people that support their opinions, and then forming these groups. And that can be thought of as a thought bubble of some sort, right? Where you're trapped in a certain perspective, you're not considering other people's perspectives and opinions, and you get trapped in that because it feels good to be part of something. It adds meaning to your life. It can even make you feel like you're part of an activist movement, that you're searching for evildoers, people that are doing wrong in society, and correcting them and trying to stand up for other people, maybe minorities of some sort or people that need help. And you feel like you're actually a do-gooder. But oftentimes we've seen examples where people that think they're doing good are actually carrying out dangerous methods at the very least, right? So we can have scenarios where the good intentions pave the road to hell, right? I think that's a famous cliche. The road to hell is paved with good intention. The second branch of non-cognitivism is prescriptivism. Prescriptivism says that moral language cannot be true or false. So same claim that was made by emotivism. Here it says that moral statements are used as a way of prescribing or recommending a way to act or behave. So when we say something that we claim to be a moral fact or a moral statement, what we're really doing is recommending a behavior to someone. We're prescribing it. That's where the word prescriptivism comes from. So when you prescribe something to someone, you hope that they would agree with you and follow that mindset. It's like you're trying to be a role model. So you can imply that a way of acting is universal and that everyone should follow it. So when you say that stealing is wrong, you are implying that it is, and that you hope nobody would steal from each other, and that you're prescribing the fact that nobody should be a thief. So stealing is wrong means you should not steal. No one should ever steal, right? You might even be able to accept some very extreme exceptions to this scenario, but I think that you would say that stealing is wrong in a general sense is true. This gets rid of the moral dilemma that something is definitely right or wrong. Now, morality is an opinion. It's not a fact. We want others to share our opinions, and that's what we care about. How often do we think about why that is? The fact that we want people to share our opinions. Think about your friend group. Do you want to make friends with people that don't have any of the same values that you do, or disagree with everything that you believe in? Sometimes it might be, intellectually fun to spar with people and have debates. But I think that it is definitely human nature to want people around that are somewhat like you, that share the same kind of values that you have and believe in some of the same kind of opinions. Now we've come to the most serious situation, the biggest problem perhaps, with the non-cognitivism perspective. Morality at this point has become subjective. It's situation-based. It's a matter of opinion only. There's no objective truth to morality. Well, many people like to say that when they have moral discussions or debates. And I think that you need to think it through a lot before you jump to conclusions based on those statements. Because there is definitely truth to these statements, but we can't use them to justify very dangerous ideas, or at least we shouldn't. If all moral statements are opinions, saying murder is wrong would be seen as just as trivial as saying that I'm not a fan of broccoli. But I don't think we want to live in a world where we only give the statement murder is wrong the equal amount of seriousness as what your digestive preferences are or what your food choices are. This really simplifies morality to a point where personal identity and values get trivialized so much that there's nothing important about what you value. Even if you believe it to your core or believe something so strongly it's part of your identity, it doesn't really matter. It really can get trivialized. So perhaps we have to consider morality to be more complex than these two approaches are willing to admit. And I think that's the truth of the matter, right? Sometimes we talk a lot about things in philosophy and then we get to a point where we realize, well, morality is an ongoing problem. It's a fundamental question of philosophy. It's an open question, some people label it as. and we have to continue to talk about it and try to figure out the best way. So for those of you that skipped ahead and moved past the more technical part of the lesson, this is where the modern connection part begins. So the modern connection we're making with these ideas from today is the concept of cultural relativism. So what exactly does that mean? Well, cultural relativism says that ideas about right and wrong, or moral codes as some people refer to them as, differ from culture to culture. That is a premise that not very many people would deny. It's pretty basic to see that cultures have different codes of conduct from each other. Now, these can be cultures across time, so past cultures could have different ideas of right and wrong than we do now. This is obvious within our own culture, as we can see that society has changed in terms of what they think is acceptable or not, but also cultures that exist at the same time. So our country or our culture could have much different values than a different country or a different culture. That's pretty obvious. But this observation leads many thinkers to conclude that universal truth is a myth. They somehow make a leap here that because cultures differ in their values, in their morals, that universal truth must therefore not exist. It must be a myth because things are different everywhere you look. And then they would also say that any moral debate that people have is strictly a matter of opinion. Let's ask ourselves, is this cultural differences argument valid? Because this is definitely an idea that could be represented in argument form. So the trouble that I see, and that many other people have seen in the past, is that the conclusion does not really follow from the premise. We seem to be making a logical jump at some point. So even if the premise is true, which I accept and most people do accept, that there are different codes of conduct between cultures, the conclusion can still be false. Right? That would just mean that it's not a logically strong argument. In fact, it's quite logically weak. Now the premise here makes a statement about what people believe. Right? It says people believe different things between cultures. So that's true. We can accept that. People believe different things in different societies. Completely agree. The conclusion states what actually is the case. Focus in on that detail. So they say that different opinions automatically equals no universal truth. This argument ignores the possibility that one opinion is mistaken about the truth. This does not mean that in any comparison, one is always right and one is always wrong. That is one possibility of a moral scenario, right? So you have two cultures that disagree on something. It is possible that one could be right and one could be wrong, or there's the possibility that both could be wrong. Or there's the possibility that neither could be wrong and that they're both right in some way and they both contribute to the conversation. So due to all of these possibilities, the argument here is not valid. So let's go back and re-examine why that is. The premise is that there are different opinions between cultures. The conclusion is that there's no such thing as universal truth. That is logically weak. There does not seem to be a strong connection between the premise and the conclusion. And let's continue to examine why. Consider this. In some societies, people believe the earth is flat. Now maybe you don't believe that statement, but I think we know that there are flat earthers out there. So let's just assume there's a group of people that believe the earth is flat. We can call them a society or we can just call them a group. In other societies or groups like ours, people believe the earth is roughly spherical. Right? We say spherical even though it's not exact, but we know it's, some people say round, some people say spherical. More accurately, it is spherical. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Would it now be a valid argument that since these two societies or groups of people disagree on the nature of the earth, that there is no objective truth in geography? Right? That doesn't make sense. Right? Just because there's a disagreement about something doesn't mean that you automatically say there's no such thing as the truth of the matter. There could be a truth of the matter even though there's a disagreement. That's a pretty obvious thing, but for some reason cultural relativism decided that there's no such thing as universal truth because there's a disagreement. and that is where the argument ultimately fails. So of course this is not the case. Of course this is not a valid argument to say that because there are differences, there's no such thing as truth. We cannot draw such conclusions because we realize that one is wrong. You can't say, well, one person is wrong, so therefore there's no such thing as truth. That just is a bad argument. There is no reason to think that because the earth is round, everyone must know it, right? There could be a time when people don't know this as a general fact. In fact, there was that time, right? There was a time in society, in Western society, some of the most advanced societies around, did not know that the earth was round. There are many other facts that we now know to be true that were not known in the past. A very common one is the fact that the earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. Some people in society at the time of this discovery faced extreme social pressure and judgment because they made this discovery. Galileo, right? So sometimes we can be in a place where most of society is actually wrong about something, and very few people are actually correct about it. The point of the matter here is that we can do the same kind of reasoning for moral truth. Many people will ultimately deny that moral truth exists, and that's fine. We'll get to a point in this class where we can discover whether universal moral truths exist for all cultures. But it doesn't seem reasonable right now to say that if there is a statement, a moral statement or judgment that most people agree is right or wrong, it doesn't mean that everyone must know it at that time. There's definitely a lot of scenarios where some people, some cultures, some groups might not recognize the right or wrong of something. So the major flaw of cultural relativism seems to be that it has this attempt, it makes an attempt to derive a conclusion about a subject, which is morality, from the mere fact that people disagree about it. So it's using a little twist of logic here to say, well, there's a disagreement here, so therefore there is no truth. Right? Try using that with your parents or a couple of your friends. Right? Ask them their opinion on something and then catch them in a disagreement and then say, well, there's no right answer because you disagree. They're not going to buy that logic, and neither should we as practicing philosophers. So some people see cultural relativism as a bad idea, an illogical idea, but they don't necessarily go to the conclusion that it's dangerous or that it has bad consequences. Well, let's take a look at that now. We've been able to show that the argument is invalid, but we didn't necessarily disprove the conclusion yet. What happens if we take this conclusion seriously? Would it be problematic or even dangerous? Well, let's think of some of the results, some of the consequences for society if we accept cultural relativism. Let's just all pretend that we believe this argument 100% right now. Well, first of all, if we do that, we could no longer say that customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own. A lot of people don't like to do that anyways. They have this sort of logical argument that criticizing another custom or another culture is automatically wrong because it shows cultural judgment, or some people even jump to the word racism. Keeping an open mind about other people's customs and behaviors is definitely a good idea. We don't want to necessarily judge some other culture's diet or art or clothing or any kind of behavior they have simply because it's different, right? We don't want to be judgmental in that way. But we definitely want to keep open the possibility of saying that an idea is bad if we believe it's bad, or saying that a practice is bad if we believe it's bad. If we actually wholeheartedly buy into cultural relativism, it would prevent us from concluding that certain practices are wrong. Practices like cannibalism, infanticide, slavery, anti-Semitism. Other cultures, whether they be past cultures or even cultures today, practice these behaviors. Are we willing to say that none of these are wrong because cultural relativism is true? That we have no judgment to make of any other culture's behaviors because there's no such thing as moral truth? Do you accept that, or do you see a problem with that? A second consequence. If we accept cultural relativism, we could decide whether actions are right or wrong just by consulting the standards of our society. Maybe people like that idea. It makes it a lot easier to figure out what is right or wrong. If objective truth is a myth and morality is simply what our culture says is good, then we must accept whatever the moral code is and cannot criticize it. So in South Africa, during apartheid, a resident would have to conclude that racial segregation is morally right because the society says so. In Nazi Germany, putting Jewish people into concentration camps would be seen as a morally justified act because the government said so, because the society accepted it. Any other terrible practice that we can think of that has happened through history or even today, we would have to say that that's right because society says it's right. Remember, we're saying that there is no moral truth. Whatever a society says is the truth or says is morally right or wrong is what we have to follow. But few people think that their society is perfect, and we can always think of ways to improve it. Finally, let's look at a third consequence of cultural relativism. The idea of moral progress is called into question. There are some changes in our society that we think have made things better. Women's rights today are vastly improved compared to many past time periods. If cultural relativism is correct, we can't actually claim that this is progress. We can't look back and say, that time period was less morally advanced than us, and we know better today. Because that would be claiming that today's society is better than a different time society. And cultural relativism says you can't do that. It says that cultures differ over time and during the same time in what they believe is right and wrong. You can't judge anyone. There's no such thing as moral truth. So saying that a past society is wrong and today's society is right is meaningless. It doesn't make sense according to cultural relativism. If they were following the social standards of their time, which these societies were when they treated women in a different way, in a less acceptable way by today's standards, we must just say that they were doing the right thing. We must accept what they were doing as correct. Who wants to go back in society and look at all the things that we think were wrong and say, no, those were right because society said they were right? Nobody wants to do that, so the cultural relativism argument falls apart again. So here's our final conclusion. If we have good reasons to state that some practices like slavery and anti-Semitism are wrong wherever they occur, it makes sense that our society has made moral progress but is imperfect and could always get better. If we're going to say those things, if we're willing to conclude those statements, then we must reject cultural relativism, since it claims that these judgments don't make sense. So what do you think? Cultural relativism, good idea or bad argument?